in Jacob's Quest, and tonight I just got back from watching the brand new Lord of the Rings movie, War of the Rohirrim, and this one is interesting. So this is an anime movie that was in theaters based on Lord of the Rings, and it feels, at least like in my own personal circles, it feels like not a lot of people even knew that this was coming out, that this currently exists. But yeah, it's a new Lord of the Rings movie in theaters right now. And yeah, this one is interesting for a lot of different reasons. I feel like, one, of course, Warner Brothers still owns I think they just own the movie rights and maybe the video game rights to the Lord of the Rings franchise. And of course, Amazon over there has the TV show rights, or at least, I don't know. I don't know exactly like where the lines are drawn as to who can do what. But anyways, of course, they still own the licensing for all this, so they want to make something. It's been a long time now since even the Hobbit movies have come out, so it's like, yeah, go ahead and experiment. And I think, if nothing else, I appreciate this movie from that aspect of like, hey, they swung for something really different and weird. They made an anime, with a Rohirrim based battle, so there's no elves, there's no there's barely any orcs, there's no you know what I mean, there's not a lot of Lord of the Rings connections here. They try to make a couple, which I think are kind of forced, but this is really just about the humans and Rohan and that whole aspect of it. So it feels a little bit like a gamble that they took here, because not only is it an anime, which I feel like even today there's a lot of people that just kind of dismiss that offhand of oh, it's not live action, then it's whatever, and they just dismiss it entirely just off that. But also, this is based on the human characters of this franchise, and so if that's not something that you were super invested in the movies, if Rohan of it all was not your favorite part or something, I feel like you might have trouble getting invested in this movie, because that's what this is, obviously. So let's go ahead and just dive right into it. And the first thing I feel like we have to address here is that, and this has been a conversation since the first trailers for this thing dropped. The main character of this movie is the daughter of Helm Hammerhand, King Helm Hammerhand, who is the famous king of Rohan, and he had this whole story in the lore. And look, I am not some Tolkien purist. I don't know everything that happens in the books and all that stuff. I've done some base level research. I've tried to dabble in it every once in a while, but I'm not going to sit here and claim to know everything that's happening. But from my understanding, while Helm Hammerhand has large sections of appendices and whatever else dedicated to his story and what he does, his daughter is someone who is just barely mentioned. It's like a footnote, one sentence, oh, and he also had a daughter, that's whereas this movie makes her the central character and basically tries to make her Eowyn from the Two Towers, a lot of characteristics of Eowyn, and wanting to be a shield maiden of Rohan, which makes sense, right? They were both from the same place and they have similar familial connections to the king, so it makes sense that those two characters would kind of line up in many different ways. But yeah, I think a lot of people, Tolkien purists and whatever else, or maybe just maybe some usual suspects here on the internet, got kind of upset that oh, the main character is a woman and it's a lady, and they're just trying to, oh, it's gotta be a female character, the same usual people are saying that kind of stuff. But I will say this, when you look at what happens from a story standpoint, and I'll go ahead and get into some spoilers in a second, but it does make more sense that you need someone else other than Helm Hammerhand to be the leading character, especially after a specific thing happens. It's okay, well, how do you finish the story? So you kind of need someone else to be the main character, and so I think it makes sense. Are there other options they could have chosen? Sure, but I don't mind this at all. And I think when I look at stuff like this, and even the movies, and then the, especially like the Rings of Power TV show, I think there are varying degrees of which you can call something an adaptation. Some things are based on this, some things are more direct, like this is one-to-one adaptations of this thing, and then other things are like, you're like lightly inspired. Like Rings of Power, the TV show, it's more inspired by the appendices and the Silmarillion and stuff. It's like inspired by that stuff, not really based on that stuff, which I would say this one is definitely more in line with how they took the Hobbit trilogy, and they kind of like had to add in all this stuff in order to fill out those runtimes. And so you have these characters who otherwise didn't have much to them. Suddenly they have so many more lines, and they try to give them character arcs, and they try to give them this and that. And that's kind of what this feels like a lot of the times, like they, characters who in the lore might have little to nothing at all said about them. Suddenly you're like, well, we're trying to make a whole movie here, so we got to give them character arcs, we got to give them personalities and lines of dialogue and action scenes that were never mentioned in any of the books, and that's just kind of how I see this. Very similar to the Hobbit trilogy, not so much the Rings of Power, where the Rings of Power will just make up entirely new things, and then that's like a whole season of that, which I don't mind, but it is definitely, like I said, different levels of what you would call an adaptation of this work. Like some of it's based on, some of it's inspired by. Anyways, so overall, this movie, this movie has a lot of really beautiful scenes, obviously, right? Like hand-drawn anime style. It's still in the realm of the movies, so like the way that all the buildings and the armor and all this stuff of Rohan looks in the movies, that's still the way it looks here, which makes sense, right? So like, okay, cool, we kind of visually already connect and have some sort of emotional tie to what I'm looking at here, just the buildings and the way everything looks, and I'm like, yeah, that's right, because I love those movies, so I can already see that this is set in that same version of this, the same vision of what this would look like. And some of the action scenes are definitely great. I will say there are times, and I'm no animation expert, so don't take my word for this meaning much, but there are times, and this might have been my theater, but like it felt like the frame rate of the animation, especially early on in the movie, was like really choppy. And I don't know if that was like the projector that my movie theater was using or something else was going on, but there are moments where like a character is running and I'm like, I can see the frames like skipping as they're running. I'm like, what's going on here? Something's happening. So I am curious to watch this movie again to see if maybe it was just my theater, or if I see that complaint elsewhere where like, oh yeah, some of the animation just it's really choppy and they're just missing frames entirely. I don't know. But otherwise, it's a very pretty looking movie. There is definitely some CGI that's pretty noticeable, and it doesn't blend that well with the 2D animation. I think that could have been done better, but overall, it looks very nice. And I'm like, okay, like you can take many frames from this and make this the screensaver of your desktop, and it'd be pretty cool to look at. As far as like the stakes of things and like oh, this epic battle, they're definitely telling the story of what happened, right? The War of Rohirrim, they go to Helm's Deep, they're fighting against the Dunland people and I don't know if necessarily the Easterlings or whatever the lore is. These other people, the wild folk, they kind of team up together, and then they have to go to Helm's Deep to defend against them, and they're stuck there all winter, and all this stuff happens, right? I think for my thing is that a lot of this definitely felt so lower stakes than the War of the Ring, obviously, because that's more of like, that felt like almost a global war, a global conflict between all these different nations working together, trying to fight off this one whole country of Mordor, right? Whereas this feels like such a small, localized very personal battle between Rohan and this other group of humans just to the east of them who were like, oh dang it, you killed my dad, now I want revenge. And it's just like that very small personal story. So while they're doing all these epic action scenes and the battles, you kind of can't help but try to compare it to the last time we saw Helm's Deep, which felt bigger. You know, the armies were bigger. There's like thousands and thousands of orcs and hundreds and thousands of humans trying to like defend them, and you know, the whole thing. It doesn't quite hit the same scale. You know, this one's much more of a personal story, much more of them being like isolated and stuck inside of here during the winter time. And now that is to say, we still get a lot of great sequences. You know, I think especially as kind of you see the myth of Helm Hammerhand being built, of like, oh, he's a wraith, he's coming out of the, you know, like he comes out of the snow, he's not even human anymore, he's tearing people to pieces with his bare hands, you know. And he kind of like builds up this mythology of like this great guy, you know, and him being stuck frozen in the snow in this like victory pose, and that's how they find him dead, frozen, but like he was still victorious even in his like dying moments. He was still like standing up with his hammer raised, you know. It's like really cool stuff like that. But yeah, I think it never quite reaches the same epicness of any of the conflicts in the movie. I think a good comparison, like, this feels more like the Battle of Five Armies than it does the Rings of Power, you know. I mean, Battle of the Ring, you know what I mean, the War of the Ring. So there's that, but also I feel like I do gotta talk about some other things. So okay, Helm Hammerhand, spoiler alert, he dies during the conflict because the winter has come and they're stuck in Helm's Deep and he's frozen there, and he's taken out a lot of guys, but he does die, and so the conflict's not over. So, and this is kind of where I was like, yeah, it makes sense to have a different character, you know, be there for the final act here. But we get a lot of repeating things that happened in the Two Towers, and I don't know if this is how it says it happened in the lore, but we even have like, oh look, over the ridge we have the arrowlings, the cavalry arrives at sunset and they all charge down the slope, and I'm like, yeah, this is exactly what happened in the movie. That's interesting, you know. So I'm like, is that the way it is in the lore? I don't know. I need to look up this battle a little bit more, but in any case, you know, they definitely try to match what happened, and we kind of remind us of those epic moments, but it just doesn't quite get there. I think there's also a couple times when they try to force these Lord of the Rings connections when they don't really make sense. The first one I don't mind so much. They're out in the snow, they're stuck there at Helm's Deep, and for some reason there's a couple of orcs there, like literally just two orcs, and they're picking up the bodies of the fallen soldiers and they're collecting the rings that these soldiers had. And they're like, huh, remember Mordor asked us to collect rings, I wonder what they want with those. And that's really all that happens there. It does lead to a battle where Helm gets to fight a giant creature, and that's pretty cool to see, but you know, it felt like something they just did so they could put it in the trailer, which was, they put that in the trailer. So I'm like, okay, so you just wanted to have like an orc hand with a bag full of rings, and just to like kind of pique our interest, be like, oh, Lord of the Rings, you know. When it has nothing to do with anything that's going on. I think the other, really, and this is the only one that bothered me because it was just so on the nose that I was like, why? You know, you can pull back a little bit. It's at the very end of the movie. At the very, very end of the movie, our main character, she is leaving Rohan because, you know, they talk about how, oh, she's wild and free, and so she's gonna go just run off and live her life and whatever, right? She talks about like, oh, I've been invited unexpectedly, and I got this letter, and I'm gonna meet a wizard, right? And we all know who the wizard is. And then she's asked like, well, what's the wizard's name? He's like, oh, he's got many names, right? And you know, and I'm sitting there thinking like, okay, yeah, we know who it is, you can just leave it there. And then she shows the person she's talking to this envelope that has Gandalf's rune marking that he leaves, and that's kind of like his symbol that he leaves on Bilbo's door. All right, and I'm like, okay, that's a good place to leave it. And then right before they cut away from her, she's like, some in the plain language he's called Gandalf. And then I'm like, I don't know, it felt like so, it felt almost like a studio note. Like, it felt like an executive was like, hey, don't leave any subtlety here, make sure the audience knows she's gonna go see Gandalf, you have to say his name. You know, that's what it felt like. Because I'm like, you could have just left it that you're gonna see a wizard, and we get it, we know who you're talking about, like, but okay, whatever. Anyways, that's War of the Rohirrim. You know, it's got some great action scenes, and the animation for the most part is really, really pretty. You know, and again, I don't know if that some of that frame choppiness was just my theater or not. But overall, the story, it's just okay. I think like they try to make it like a really personal kind of revenge story, and you know, at times you do kind of feel something, but it just never quite gets there. And I don't know how you would get there without turning this into a much bigger global conflict, you know, even though that would deviate highly even more from the lore of what's supposed to be happening here. I think that if you're someone who just wants to sit here and look at an anime version of Lord of the Rings and see these locations and this like the armor designs, and you want to see some, you know, a couple of cool action sequences, you're gonna get that here. You know, you're gonna be like, okay, this is worth my time. It's a little bit long. I think they could have taken a good 20-30 minutes out of this movie. You know, there's a lot of quiet moments, and I'm like, you know what, you could have shaved down the runtime a little bit. If you're someone who is a Tolkien purist and you're like, I only accept absolute canon, you know, I think you already know that you're gonna have a problem with this movie because a lot of the stuff they're making up as it goes. But yeah, I think it's a good time worth checking out. Maybe you might want to wait for streaming because it feels its length. I think that's the other thing. I didn't even look up how long it was, but like it felt like it was a good 2 hours 20 minutes, something like that. Because I'm like, there were times I'm sitting there like, how much longer has this got? They've been stuck at Helm's Deep for so long, and they also do this narration, this overall narration of like they'll skip time and they'll just talk about like, oh, the winter was difficult and many people did this, and I don't know, that kind of felt almost unnecessary also, right? Like it kind of felt like they're holding your hand, explaining everything that's going on by having a narrator explain the events, when I guess you could do that at the beginning, you know, kind of reminiscent of Fellowship of the Ring and how you have that opening narration. But this movie just kind of does that periodically throughout, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. Like, I guess it helps the context of what's supposed to be happening, but it also, like, you can show us that in the movie. You know, like you don't have to keep on having this narrator show up and explaining how hard winter was. But anyways, I had a good enough time. I don't think that this is gonna be for everyone. You know, this is definitely not gonna be as mass appeal as those original movies were. Some of you might even get bored. I think that's going to be another thing, you know, like there's a lot of quiet moments. There's a lot of just like taking in the scenery of like this really beautiful imagery that they drew. But I can see some people being like, man, this is really slow. And then, and there are times when not a lot of stuff is happening. So there's that. I also do kind of wonder, like, when people hear Lord of the Rings anime, maybe they envision a much flashier action sequences than this one. Like, this one keeps the action grounded. Like, people are punching each other and sword fighting each other, and there's not a lot of times when they, you know, do crazy camera angles and like have all like really fast, unrealistic action. It's like they keep this very grounded in the way that like actors could have done this kind of thing. So if some people walk in thinking anime Lord of the Rings and they're expecting you know, insane like breaking physics kind of action. You're not really gonna get that. It's very realistic still, at least in terms of like the way people move and what they can do for action sequences. Because remember, these are not elves; these are the human characters. So, you know, you're not gonna have Legolas doing his brick hopping that he did in The Hobbit, where he's jumping from falling brick to falling brick, which is always pretty funny. Anyways, that is War of the Rohirrim. I think it's a pretty good time, but it's not great. It's like, I can see them doing something like this again, but they gotta pick either a more interesting story or a more interesting way of telling it, because while there is plenty of action here, it just, I don't know, it doesn't quite have the punch that the War of the Ring had, you know. So maybe it's just like that over, you know, maybe it's just because we know what's gonna happen, and we know that Sauron is not involved here, and, you know, Mordor is not involved with any of this, and this is just like a very small personal thing, and maybe that just like stops it from being epic feeling. It just kind of feels like a, oh man, I hope they get out of this one. You know, like it just kind of feels like an episode of a weekly TV show that they could make, you know, or like a one season of a Netflix show. I don't know. Anyways, let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys next time.